cold wind lashed the supply yard, and snow sealed the crates in a white crust like a mark of fate. She was only the food runner, clipboard in hand, eyes down, a name nobody bothered to learn. Soldiers slid past her, the way they slid past sacks of rice. But on the road back, she saw deep, fresh track links cut into the snow, wheel patterns that did not belong to their own. She stopped, listened, counted, then turned around not to deliver more, but to pull the enemy's main force into a single white corridor. The next morning, when the battle map was updated, a vast blank space appeared where the main force had been. She had driven the snow routes for 2 winters, first as a junior clerk, then as a driver who knew where the drifts buried road markers and where the wind carved ice ridges across the flats. The depot sat in a shallow valley behind the line, its sheds framed by bare poplar and a low berm of packed snow. Her job was to move food, fuel, and batteries from the rear to the forward caches, sign for each delivery, log each return. She learned to read the wind on the open stretches, to feel when the tires would sink, and to keep her engine from choking in the hard cold. Her name was Erin Holt, and in their chain of command she had no authority worth mentioning. Officers called her only when they needed crates in place before dawn or when a route froze over, and they wanted to know which detour would still hold a truck. She was rarely asked for opinions, never invited to briefings. When she spoke, she did so in short, practical reports, and most of the time the men in the command bunker nodded without listening. The front was tense. The opposing force had gone quiet, then begun a slow, deliberate buildup. Reports reached them about columns moving through the hills, but the maps were old, and the weather was violent enough to smother aerial sight. Their own main force was stretched across a long line, thin in places, dependent on supply runs that now took twice the fuel and 3 times the time. The officers talked about enemy numbers, about a looming push. Erin watched their faces from the doorway, holding a file box while they argued. She left without being asked a single question. The supply yard was a place of routines, engines warming before dawn, loaders counting crates by touch, foremen with frost on their lashes. Erin moved through it like a shadow, a figure of motion and responsibility without any formal power. She knew how many cans of diesel had arrived the night before, which canvas would tear at a seam, which driver would be late because his heater was weak. Her mind tracked the small details, the daily points of failure. She was aware that in a war of movement and force, a missing pallet could break a plan as surely as a lost battalion. She had not expected to be there. Before the war tightened its grip on the northern line, she had been in a state engineering program, studying transport routes and the movement of heavy equipment. She had learned to map gradients and calculate weight limits, to read the land for blind points and natural corridors. A family emergency had pulled her home, and she had taken a practical job in logistics to stay near her mother. When the draft came, she entered service through the Supply Corps because she could drive and keep a vehicle running in cold. Her knowledge came with her, but no one asked for it. She was not resentful, only clear-eyed. Chain of command was a structure to hold under pressure, and the line officers were under pressure. The problem was not their presence, but their blind spots. When a system was built to listen only to certain voices, it missed the words of those who saw the ground directly. Erin knew the ground. She drove it every day. She understood its shifts in a storm the way a sailor reads a tide. The next morning she ran a routine loop to a forward cache, a stack of barrels and canvas hidden in a stand of pines. The road was barely a road, just a packed groove between low drifts. On the return, she cut across a shorter route she had used in summer, a line that was risky in winter but usually saved an hour. Halfway through, she saw the marks. The track links were wider than anything in her own unit, the spacing a little different, and the depth told her the weight. There were also drag marks, low arcs, that shaved the snow as if something heavy had been pulled by steel cable. These were not from their own trucks, and not from patrols. The traces told a story of repeated movement, a flow in one direction that had churned the ground into a frozen churn. She stopped her truck, the wind snapped at the canvas, and the engine ticked down into a hollow idle. Erin crouched, brushed snow aside, and counted the tread spacing with her gloved fingers. A second line of tracks ran parallel, deeper, with a wide wheel pattern that suggested artillery or heavy ammunition hauled on sleds. The trackways cut toward a shallow ridgeline, and then dropped into a corridor of trees that marked a natural funnel. She had seen their own convoys avoid that corridor because of a blind bend and a narrow bridge. The enemy apparently had not. The tracks were fresh. The top edges were sharp, not softened by wind. The snow at the edges had not crusted. That meant movement within the last day, perhaps within hours. Aaron looked for scatter, for evidence of careless speed or deliberate spacing. It was deliberate. The track marks were evenly spaced, the path consistent, as if the column had moved under discipline. She counted the spacing between deeper indentations and estimated the weight of each vehicle. That weight suggested armored transport or heavy cargo. The drag marks suggested towed guns or heavy ammunition sleds. She traced the line with her eyes and felt, in the back of her mind, a shift of the map. The corridor had a name in their logistics charts. The Alder Cut, a short pass between two low ridges that narrowed into a single-lane bridge. The bridge, a rough timber structure, had been rated for medium loads. They avoided it when running heavy fuel because the supports had not been reinforced since summer. Aaron knew the bridge because she had called in the maintenance request herself. It was still pending. The enemy, if they used the corridor with heavy units, would be moving into a natural choke point. If they moved a large force into that choke point, they would be relying on the corridor as a safe route. Aaron did not think of it as a trap yet, but she saw its shape. Back at the depot, she filed a report, then asked to speak to the operations officer on duty. When she finally got 2 minutes, she described the tracks, the width, the direction, the number of passes. The officer glanced at the weatherboard, then at the map. He shook his head and told her to stick to her runs. He said it was probably their own vehicles or a harmless patrol. He asked her to let intelligence do its job. Aaron said she had driven every route within 20 miles, and those tracks were not theirs. The officer dismissed her without looking up again. She walked out with the same file box in her hands, and no one asked where she had learned to read track marks. No one in that room knew that she had once studied route reconnaissance at an engineering school before being reassigned to logistics after a family emergency. She did not mention it. In her experience, names and credentials meant little to people who had already decided who could speak. She did not give up. She spoke to a sergeant she trusted, a man named Victor Hale who ran a maintenance crew and had a practical mind. He listened, nodded once, and said he would pass it upward if he could. He added, with a small shrug, that intelligence reports were thin and the command staff had been waiting for hard proof. Tracks were not hard proof to them. Aaron said they were to her. She knew the kind of time it took to cut a route through new snow. She knew the weight of a vehicle by the depth it pressed. She knew that a column moving into the Alder Cut meant purpose. That afternoon, she drove a second route, more distant, to see if she could find more signs. The sky was low and slate gray. The snow shimmered with a hard crust. She found another set of marks, similar spacing, similar depth, leading toward the same corridor. It was not a patrol. It was a repeated movement. She felt the pattern settle into her mind like a grid drawn in pencil. She returned to the depot and wrote a second report, this one more formal, including estimated vehicle weights, the likely origin of the tracks, and the map grid where the corridor entered the ridgeline. She slipped it into the operations box and took her next assignment. The depot did not change because of her report. Trucks still rolled. Drivers still shouted for more tarps. The foreman still waved his clipboard in a storm. But Aaron's mind had changed. She had seen a door in the landscape and felt an enemy stepping through it. She could not unsee it. The blizzard arrived that night, a dense wall that turned headlights into halos and made radio calls break into static. The main force received a briefing based on an outdated map that still showed summer crossings and did not mark the new snow berms. The intelligence report, thin and cautious, suggested the enemy would push along the main valley, not the ridge corridor Aaron had seen. Command chose to meet them head-on, assigning the strongest units to a forward engagement in open ground where their own vehicles could maneuver. Aaron was on the night shift, moving fuel to a staging point when she heard the order crackle across the net. She knew the main force was about to place itself in the enemy's path at a bad angle, in a low basin with a single, narrow exit. She could picture the corridor of trees, the tracks cutting into it, the heavy drag marks that implied artillery. The enemy was not aiming for the basin. They were moving into the funnel. She pulled her truck off the route and studied the snow. Even in the storm, she could see the wind-sculpted lines and the faint shadows where tracks had pressed the surface. The enemy had used the corridor recently. If she did nothing, their own main force would move to meet a push that would not come, and the enemy would arrive elsewhere with mass and momentum. She reported again, this time over radio. The channel was crowded and harsh with interference. Her words were cut by static. The response was a warning to keep the net clear. She tried a second time, a third. She was told to return to her route and not improvise. She did so, but the decision in her mind was already set. The blizzard wore down the night. The wind moved like a living thing, carving scours across the road and blowing snow into the ditches. Erin's truck fought the drifts. She moved fuel to the staging point and then another set of batteries to a comms relay. Each stop exposed her to the cold, and she felt it through the seams of her coat. But the cold was not what kept her awake. It was the silence in the command bunker, the heavy assurance of men who looked at their maps and believed the fight would arrive from the valley. She considered the chain of command. It was not broken. It was simply locked to a map that did not reflect the ground. The intelligence team had not been able to confirm enemy movement in the blizzard. The officers had a duty to make a decision. They had chosen the likely path on an old map, not the track in fresh snow. Erin knew the cost of bad maps. She had lost a truck in a whiteout the previous winter because a marker pole had shifted. She had learned to look for the land's own cues, the line of scrub that marked a ditch, the windbreak that marked a ridge. At the staging point, she overheard two infantrymen talking about the upcoming engagement. They sounded calm, resigned in the way soldiers become when orders are clear. She did not interrupt. She thought about what would happen if the enemy moved through the alder cut unopposed and emerged behind the line. The main force would be in the basin with a single exit. Supply lines would be cut, units would be exposed, and the fight would turn into a chase through snow with poor visibility. The danger was not abstract. She could imagine the line collapsing in slow motion as the enemy appeared where they should not be. She weighed her options. She could attempt to reach command again, but the net was crowded and her previous warnings had been ignored. She could wait and see, but waiting would mean surrendering to the wrong map. She could act on her own, but that meant crossing the line between logistics and operations. She did not want to cross it. She did not seek glory or to prove someone wrong. She wanted to keep the line alive. By morning, she was called in. A senior logistics officer told her that her reports had caused confusion, that she was undermining the chain of command. She was warned that her truck could be reassigned if she continued to speak above her station. He reminded her that logistics existed to deliver, not to direct. Erin listened without expression. She nodded, signed the warning form, and went back to the yard. Her own crew hesitated. A loader named Marcus Reed asked quietly whether she had seen something worth the trouble. Erin did not argue. She said only that the tracks had been deep enough to pull a bridge down if the wrong weight hit it. Another driver, Owen Kessler, said they would follow orders. The depot foreman told her to keep her head down. Erin did not raise her voice or demand a hearing. She did not storm the command bunker. She chose a path that did not require permission. If she could not make them listen, she could make the terrain speak for her. She knew the routes, the caches, the way supply lines drew attention even in a storm. She knew the enemy would react to opportunities for fuel and food, and she knew which corridor would draw them in. She spent that afternoon reading the route logs, not with official sanction but with the quiet access of a logistics clerk. She compared recent movements, looked for signs that enemy scouts had been close to supply lines. She found two incidents: a supply tarp slashed on a remote cache, and a set of boot prints near a depot fence. The enemy knew where supplies moved. That meant they would take the bait if it looked real. She checked the truck manifests and saw that a fuel run was scheduled for the next evening to a forward cache near the Alder Cut. The route was flexible. Drivers often took the safer southern turn when visibility was low. She could adjust it. She could pass close to the corridor, leaving tracks that would be visible from the ridge. She could create a visible, tempting presence without firing a shot. It would be a deception based not on glamour but on the enemy's hunger for fuel and food. She could also shape the terrain by timing. If she left at the right time, she could ensure the enemy observed the convoy and moved into the pass before their own main force engaged in the basin. She would need the main force to shift. That required a report from someone the command staff would listen to. Erin knew one name in the engineering platoon, a man who had helped her find winter tires. If she could show him the enemy in the pass, he might relay the information in a way the command staff would take seriously. It was a thin hope, but she had no thicker one. She prepared her plan without calling it a plan. She revised the loadout, adding extra fuel barrels and ration crates that would make sense on paper. She ensured the paperwork was consistent: extra fuel for generator use, extra rations for an infantry company that had been shifted forward. She kept the changes within typical variants. In logistics, variance was common in winter. She knew how to hide in that noise. She also prepared herself. She checked her truck's chains, tightened a loose bolt, and packed a spare line. She tested the radio, noting the static. She was not acting in panic. She was acting with intent. The decision felt heavy, and she knew it was not fully hers. But it was a decision to act, not to wait. She reorganized her next run. She scheduled it through a corridor that the enemy had been using, while keeping the manifest just within the margins of normal. She loaded extra fuel barrels in canvas-wrapped crates that smelled of rations. She did not alter the paperwork enough to alert the depot clerk, and she kept the convoy small so it could move fast. She chose a route that would place the convoy in view of the enemy corridor for just long enough to be noticed, then made sure the tracks would lead toward a narrow pass with a choke point. The pass was a short valley, steep on both sides, with a bridge over a frozen creek that could only bear a limited weight before its supports would crack. Erin knew the bridge's capacity because she had ordered a reinforcement months earlier. The reinforcement had never been installed due to lack of steel. She knew that if heavy vehicles entered the pass in close formation, the bridge would become a bottleneck, and a single blocked vehicle would trap those behind it. She also knew the cost of being wrong. If the enemy did not take the bait, she would have diverted assets and exposed supply routes without authorization. She would be charged with endangering the line. If the enemy did take the bait, the main force would have to be shifted quickly, and someone would have to decide to strike there instead of at the basin. Erin accepted that she might never see that decision in time. She accepted that she might be blamed either way. She rehearsed the route in her mind. The convoy would leave at dusk, when visibility would be low but tracks could still be seen in the snow. She would drive the lead vehicle and make a brief stop in a clearing near the corridor to ensure tracks and signs were clear. She would leave a canvas tarp and a stack of crates near the pass to suggest a temporary cache. She would keep the engines running to prevent freezing, but the sound would also carry in the cold air. She would then move through the pass and into a safe zone beyond, where she could wait and observe. She told her crew only what they needed to know. The driver behind her, Owen Kessler, would follow her route and maintain spacing. The loader, Marcus Reed, would keep the crates secure and make sure the tarps did not come loose. She did not tell them the larger purpose. She did not want to pull them into a decision they had not made, but she needed their competence. In logistics, trust came in small forms, and she relied on it. She also chose to inform Caleb Morgan, the engineer who had helped her. She drove to the engineering tent with a spare box of batteries as an excuse. She told him that enemy tracks had been seen near the Alder Cut, and that a supply convoy would pass close to it at dusk. She asked him to have a pair of observers on the ridge. She did not ask for a strike. She did not say she was baiting anything. She kept her words plain and practical. Caleb looked at her, read the urgency, and nodded once. The risk she was taking was not just in the field, it was in the rules of her own service. She had been warned. She had signed the warning. She knew that if the plan failed, she could be demoted or court-martialed. She also knew that in a war of snow and silence, the difference between caution and paralysis could be a line of white graves. Her plan was not bold in the heroic sense. It was a logistics plan, a shift in routes, a manipulation of visibility, a deliberate pattern of tracks. It was a plan born of her knowledge of how enemy scouts observed the ground. It was not magic. It was a calculated risk. The convoy left near dusk. Snow blurred the edges of the road, and the trucks kept tight spacing. Erin drove the lead vehicle. She took the turn that put her on the edge of the corridor, then slowed just enough to leave a clear trail. She made a visible stop at a small clearing, long enough to look like a breakdown, long enough for any observer to mark the position. She kept the engine running, then moved on, leaving tracks that cut straight toward the narrow pass. She had prepared the pass by moving a small stack of empty crates to the side, creating the illusion of a temporary cache. She left a canvas tarp flapping in the wind. It was not enough to lure a cautious enemy, but it was enough to confirm the presence of supplies. She placed markers simple, neutral markers used by logistics teams to indicate safe passage where they would be visible from the corridor. She did not plant devices or set traps herself. She only arranged what was already hers to move. At the rear, she radioed a brief note to a friend in the engineering platoon, a man named Caleb Morgan, who owed her a favor for winter tires she had found for his team. She told him only that the pass might matter before dawn and that he should keep a few eyes on the bridge. She did not ask for anything illegal. She did not give him orders. She gave him information. The enemy took the bait. In the night, scouts followed the tracks, confirmed the cache, and reported that a supply convoy had slipped through. At first light, the main enemy column moved into the corridor, then funneled toward the pass. Erin watched from a ridgeline, her breath freezing at the edges of her scarf. She counted vehicles and heard the low grind of treads on packed snow. The night was cold enough to crack wood. The truck's engines hummed like strained muscle. As Aaron approached the clearing, she signaled and slowed, letting the convoy slightly. The stop was brief. Marcus Reed stepped down, pulled at a tarp, made a show of adjusting a strap. Their headlights cast long beams through the snow. Aaron knew that any observer on the ridge could see those lights. She waited just long enough to leave a clear impression of vulnerability, then moved on, the tracks arcing toward the pass. She felt the risk physically, a pressure in her chest, but she drove with the same steady control she used on every run. She could not afford a slip. A stuck truck would become a real breakdown, and then the bait would be too real. She kept the convoy in tight formation and used the lowest gear when the road climbed. At the pass, she followed her plan. She stopped and had Marcus unload the empty crates. The action looked like a drop. The crates were light and empty, but they were the right size and shape to suggest rations. She hung the tarp as if to cover them. She placed a simple route marker on a post, the kind of marker that indicated safe passage to a cache. In a storm, it was a practical tool. In a deception, it was a lure. She did not plant any explosive. She did not sabotage the bridge. She left the bridge as it was, a simple timber structure with strain lines in its supports. She knew that if the enemy sent heavy units, the bridge would become a limit all on its own. Once through the pass, she stopped in a sheltered hollow and waited. The convoy parked under a line of spruce where the wind fell. The men did not talk much. They sat in their cabs and listened to the wind. Aaron climbed a small rise and looked back toward the corridor. The sky was low, and the snow carried sound. She waited for the grind of treads and the faint pulse of engines. It came before dawn. She watched the enemy scouts move along the line of tracks. They were careful, moving with the discipline of people who had survived winter operations. They paused at the clearing, checked the crates, then moved along the tracks toward the pass. They did not touch the bridge. They moved back into the corridor, and, when the sun cut a thin line of light over the ridge, the main column followed. Aaron counted. She estimated the number of vehicles, their spacing, their likely payloads. She noted the heavy units, the likely artillery. She saw the leading vehicles reach the bridge and slow. She saw the column compress. She felt a shift in her mind as the shape of the trap became clear, but a trap still needed a strike. A trap without a strike was just a corridor. She radioed Caleb again, giving him a concise report. Heavy column in the alder cut, moving toward the pass, bridge under load. Caleb's voice came back in short words. He said he would pass it to command, and that he had eyes on the ridge. That was all. Aaron did not know whether the message would reach the right ears in time. She could only watch and wait. By the time the enemy reached the pass, their column was deep in the narrow valley. The bridge was loaded well beyond its capacity. A heavy vehicle stalled at the far end, its tracks spinning, snow turning to ice under the steel. The stall forced the vehicles behind it to stop in tight sequence. The column compressed and lost spacing. The rear could not see the front. The narrow walls kept them from dispersing. Caleb's engineers had set overwatch on the ridge, and the main force, alerted by his quick report, shifted a reserve unit toward the pass. The decision to strike did not come from Aaron, but she had made the geography intelligible. When the main force arrived, they did not charge head-on. They sealed the exits, then cut in from the sides at angles that the enemy could not match in the confined space. The enemy's radios were already faltering in the valley, and the blizzard smothered their line of sight. The engagement was short and chaotic. Vehicles burned fuel without space to maneuver. The bridge failed under the load and fractured, sealing the far exit. The enemy tried to reverse, but the rear was already blocked by their own trail. The main force moved with discipline, firing into engines and disabling the lead and tail to freeze the line. The enemy's command structure collapsed, their formation pinned and choked until it dissolved into scattered pockets that surrendered or fled into the trees. Aaron did not fire a weapon. She did not issue a command. She watched the result of her decision unfold in a narrow strip of white where a corridor became a trap. The main force of the enemy was reduced, not by a sudden miracle, but by a chain of small, practical actions set in motion by a logistics driver who knew where tracks led. The first sign of the strike was not a blast, but a shift in sound. The rumble of engines changed pitch as the front of the enemy column slowed and then stopped. Aaron saw the vehicles bunch as the lead vehicle stalled on the bridge, tracks spinning. The bridge groaned. The supports creaked under the load. The vehicle at the far end was too heavy for the span, and its weight found the weak point. The beam cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, and the bridge sagged. It did not collapse fully, but it dropped enough to trap the lead vehicle in place. The enemy was now stuck, Behind the lead vehicle, the column compressed. The narrow walls of the pass left no room to disperse. The rear vehicles could not see why the column had stopped. They simply halted. Aaron saw men climbing from vehicles, moving forward on foot. The snow was deep, and their movement was slow. The line tightened, the spacing collapsed. When the main force arrived, it did so from above. The reserve unit moved along the ridgeline, using the terrain to mask its approach. The engineers had already marked the positions with flags and a few discrete signal panels. The strike was not a rash charge. It was a controlled seizure of the exits. The main force blocked the corridor behind the enemy and sealed the front by targeting the lead vehicle's engine. Then, with the enemy pinned, they moved into the valley from the sides, firing into engines and disabling vehicles without needing to expose themselves on open ground. The enemy's communications failed in the confined space. The blizzard scattered radio signals. The valley walls blocked line of sight. Units acted on partial information, and their formation lost coherence. The soldiers in the lead could not communicate with the rear. The rear could not move. The middle was trapped. The effect was not a sudden annihilation, but a systematic compression. The enemy's main force was choked, immobilized, and then dismantled in pieces. Aaron watched it unfold from the ridge, feeling the cold in her lungs. She saw the movement of her own units, their discipline, the way they avoided the open valley floor and used the slopes. She recognized the pattern as a result of the trap she had set, not of her own command. She did not pretend she had orchestrated the fight, but she saw the chain. Tracks to corridor, corridor to pass to choke point to strike. She had moved the first link. That had been enough. When the enemy began to break, the battle shifted into smaller actions. Some vehicles were abandoned. Small groups tried to flee up the slope into the trees and were intercepted by patrols. The snow absorbed much of the sound. The smoke of engines hung low, mixing with the blizzard. Aaron did not move. She watched until the movement in the valley slowed and then stopped, until the line of vehicles was a line of dark shapes in a white cut. She returned to her trucks and ordered the convoy back, keeping to the same route. The convoy moved out, quiet, their engines steady. The men in the convoy did not speak much. They had seen the enemy column, had heard the distant gunfire. They looked at Aaron with a new attention, a question in their eyes. She did not answer. She had no words that mattered, and her place was still with the trucks. When the battle map was updated, the enemy's main force was a blank space on the board. The line that had threatened to fold their flank was gone. The officers in the bunker stared at the gap as if it were a mistake. Reports came in from scouts. Burned vehicles in the pass, scattered equipment, prisoners who said their column had been cut off by an unexpected strike. The talk in the yard grew and folded back into itself. A few soldiers said the pass had been a lucky find. Others said it had been a trap laid with precision. Aaron returned to the depot with empty fuel drums and a manifest that matched her run. The men she passed now asked where she had gone, what she had seen. They looked at her differently, the way people look at someone who knows more than she should. Rumors spread that the supply driver had somehow pulled the enemy into the open. Her name moved through the barracks without her consent. The morning was gray and still. The wind had eased, leaving a brittle calm. Aaron walked into the yard and saw the faces turning toward her. She had not expected that. The men who had ignored her now watched her approach as if she were a messenger of a new fact. She felt the weight of their eyes and kept her expression neutral. She handed her manifest to the clerk. The clerk glanced at it, then at her, and asked where she had been. Aaron said she had delivered fuel to the forward cache and returned. The clerk nodded, but his eyes lingered. In the command bunker, officers went over the reports. The map was redrawn. The enemy's main force, once a looming marker, was now a shaded blank where units had been. The staff discussed the strike with cautious astonishment. They focused on the reserve unit's maneuver, the timing, the success. Some spoke of luck. Others spoke of the enemy's mistake in using the pass. Few mentioned the supply convoy's path. No one wanted to admit that a logistics driver had seen what they had missed, but word moved anyway. Soldiers in the yard had seen Aaron's convoy pass near the corridor. Engineers had reported the enemy's movement after following her warning. The connection was not official, but it was known. In a unit, news travels by voice and by glance. The story of a supply driver who had seen tracks and turned them into a trap was the kind of story that moved fast. Aaron did not seek to correct or embellish it. She did not tell anyone that she had done it alone, because she had not. Caleb's report had mattered. The reserve unit's disciplined strike had mattered. The enemy's decision to use the pass had mattered. She was one link in a chain, but she knew that without that link, the chain might not have held. Her own sense of the day was less triumphant than quiet. She had acted under pressure, and the result had been good, but good outcomes did not erase the risk she had taken. She thought of the warning form she had signed, the words about undermining command. She wondered whether those words would return to her. She also thought of the enemy, now pinned in the pass, and felt no personal triumph. The war did not care about personal triumph. It cared about lines and routes and whether the cold took you first. Command could not ignore what had happened, and they did not know whether to treat it as initiative or insubordination. A review was ordered. Officers asked who had altered the supply route, who had left markers near the pass, who had created what looked like a temporary cache in a tactically sensitive area. Erin was called in and asked to explain her choices. The first question was not why she had done it, but whether she had done it alone. Some wanted her as a scapegoat. A failed engagement would have needed a culprit, and a logistics driver was easy to name. The only reason the accusation did not hold was that her route logs were clean, her manifests matched, and multiple witnesses had seen the enemy tracks days earlier. Caleb submitted a formal statement that he had observed the enemy entering the pass and had alerted command, confirming the chain of information. Marcus Reed confirmed that the convoy had been standard, except for a heavier load of fuel. The depot clerk produced Erin's earlier written report about the tracks, proving she had warned command before any action. The review board concluded that her actions had been unauthorized but justified under the immediate threat and the failure of intelligence to confirm enemy movement. The language of the decision was cold and narrow. It did not praise her, but it did not condemn her. The matter was closed. The review took place in a drafty office with a heater that only worked when it felt like it. Erin sat across from 3 officers and 1 legal clerk. She answered each question with plain facts. She did not defend herself with emotion. She stated the route she had taken, the reason she had taken it, the weight of the supplies, the location of the tracks. She described her attempts to report the tracks and the responses she received. She explained the decision to leave markers at the pass as a means to indicate safe movement of the convoy. She did not speak of bait or trap. She spoke in logistic terms. The board listened, their pens scratching. One officer pressed her on whether she intended to draw the enemy into the pass. Erin said she intended to draw attention to the corridor because she believed the enemy was already moving there, and because she believed command needed to see it. She said she had not expected a full column to move on the first night, but she had anticipated that scouts would confirm the supply presence. She said she had chosen the route to make those confirmations likely. Her answer was careful. It was also honest. The board then asked about her background. She disclosed her engineering coursework, her experience with route reconnaissance, her knowledge of bridge weight limits. She explained that she had ordered reinforcements for the bridge months before, and that the request had not been filled. She did not blame anyone for that. It was the reality of supply shortages. But she wanted the board to understand that she knew the bridge could not take heavy loads. That knowledge had shaped her choice of route. The board also asked about who had helped her. Erin named Caleb Morgan as a person she had informed about the enemy tracks. She did not ask him for a strike. She had informed him because he had observers on the ridge and the ability to report to command. The board took note. They later called Caleb, who confirmed her account. Marcus Reed confirmed that he had unloaded empty crates at the pass and that Erin had told him to do so. The depot clerk provided the manifests and the written reports. The evidence was sufficient to establish that Erin had acted in good faith based on observable facts. The decision that came out of the review was not a medal. It was a line in a report that said her action had been unauthorized but justified under emergent circumstances. It said she was to be reminded to respect the chain of command, but also to continue reporting any significant terrain observations. It said the unit would review procedures for incorporating logistics observations into operations. It was a small bureaucratic shift, but it was a shift. Erin read the decision without visible reaction. She was neither relieved nor angry. The decision was what she expected, a cautious acknowledgement. She cared less about the language than about the outcome. Her job continued. The line held. The war moved on. The senior commander met her in the yard a week later, under a brittle winter sun. He offered a single sentence, short and exact, stating that her judgment had changed the outcome. There was no ceremony, no medal. He told her to keep the routes open and to report what she saw. That was the recognition she received, and it was enough to confirm that she had not imagined the tracks in the snow. Erin went back to her runs. She still carried the clipboard, still counted barrels, still drove the line of road carved into winter. But now the infantry asked, when they saw her, what she had noticed on the edges of the path. Commanders paused to hear her observations. The war did not stop, and neither did the cold. Not long after, new reports came in that the enemy was asking about a driver who read tracks, a woman who had turned a supply run into a trap. The enemy had learned that the quiet people at the back could see more than the loud men at the front. Erin heard the rumor and did not change her routine. She just checked her mirrors more often and kept her eyes on the snow. The commander did not call her into his office. He met her where she worked, in the yard with crates and snow, a place that was honest. He looked at her and said that her judgment had changed the outcome in the pass. He said it once and did not repeat it. He did not offer a promotion. He did not offer a public commendation. He spoke as a man who knew that a structure had almost failed, and that it had been held by an unexpected hand. Erin nodded. She did not smile. She felt the cold on her face and the weight of his words on her shoulders. Her routine resumed. She drove the same routes, now with more eyes on her. Soldiers asked her what she saw. She answered with the same practical tone she always used. She pointed out a drift that hid a ditch, a broken marker pole, a set of new tracks. She did not allow herself to become an oracle. She remained a driver with a good eye, nothing more. But the unit had changed in small ways. The operations officer who had dismissed her before now asked for her input on route conditions. The depot foreman listened when she suggested a change in cache placement. The system had widened, if only slightly, to include her voice. The enemy had also changed. They learned that the pass had become a trap. They learned that their column had been drawn into it by the sight of a supply convoy. They learned that a driver had read their tracks and set a pattern that led them into a choke point. It took them time to identify her name, but the rumor reached Erin before any official warning did. She heard it from a scout who had intercepted a message about a logistics woman with knowledge of the snow routes. She did not panic. She understood that in war, information moved both ways, and that visibility carried its own danger. She adjusted her habits. She checked her mirrors more often. She varied her routes within acceptable limits. She asked for a second driver on longer runs. She did not ask for protection or special treatment. She simply applied the same practical caution she used in every aspect of her job. The cold did not care about her reputation. The snow did not care about her name. She did her work and kept her eyes on the ground. The story of the past did not end. It became part of the unit's memory, a lesson about how logistics could shape a battle. The officers began to ask for more field observations from drivers. The intelligence team began to incorporate supply route information into their maps. These were small changes, but they mattered. Erin knew that the next fight would be different, but she also knew that the enemy would adapt. The rumor that they were looking for her was just a sign of their adaptation. It meant that the quiet people at the back were no longer invisible. She drove into that new reality with the same steady hands she used on every icy turn. She was not a hero in her own eyes. She was a driver who had read the snow and acted on what she saw. The rest was the war's consequence, not her personal triumph. And in a war of cold and white silence, that distinction mattered. The days after the pass were not days of celebration. They were days of sorting and repair. The supply yard shifted into a relentless rhythm. Tow teams hauled damaged vehicles from the valley. Mechanics worked by lantern light, and the medical tents filled with men who had walked out of the snow with frost in their eyes. Erin ran more routes than before because the reserve unit had consumed fuel at a rate the depot had not predicted. She wrote new manifests and updated route charts, her pencil cutting through paper that curled from the damp. The cold pressed on her knuckles, and the wind kept its constant whistle through the broken slats of the sheds. Command asked for her reports twice a day. It was not a formal change in procedure, but it was a change in expectation. She brought concise observations, a drift that was deepening near the southern fork, a stand of trees that now showed fresh boot prints, a faint haze of exhaust on the ridgeline that suggested movement beyond their patrols. She did not exaggerate. She knew that the moment she did, her value would dissolve. She spoke only to what she could see and what she could reason from what she saw. The officers wrote down what she said. Whether they believed it or simply recorded it, she could not tell. But they listened. The engineering platoon took a harder look at the alder cut. They sent a survey team to the bridge and found the old reinforcement request in the depot files. It embarrassed the supply chief, but it also forced action. Within a week, the bridge supports were shored with salvaged beams and iron brackets stripped from a damaged truck. The work was rough and imperfect, but it raised the safe weight enough to keep their own fuel runs from risking collapse. Aaron watched the repairs with a practical eye and saw the new braces as a small victory, not for her, but for the routine that kept men alive. The enemy's response was slow but careful. Their patrols began to probe the edges of the supply routes. Aaron noticed more signs of scouts, shallow footprints near a frozen creek, an abandoned ration tin half buried in snow, a piece of cloth caught on a broken branch. These were not random, they were measurements. The enemy was trying to learn the patterns of the convoy, the timing of runs, the way supplies moved behind the line. Aaron altered her routes within approved limits and kept her trucks moving at slightly varied times. It was enough to frustrate simple observation, but it could not hide the larger rhythm of a war that depended on fuel and food. She began to train other drivers to read the snow. She did it quietly, on the side of the road, by pointing out where a track cut across a drift and what its depth meant. She showed them how to tell the difference between a truck wheel and a tracked vehicle, how to see a tow line dragging, how to estimate weight by the way a tire bit into the crust. She did not call it training. She called it helpful. The drivers listened because they knew she had been right once. And in the winter, once was enough to earn attention. The skill spread in small gestures, in short comments, in the way a driver leaned out of a cab and paused to look before moving on. The more people watched the ground, the more reports came in. Some were valuable, some were noise. Aaron found herself sorting through them in her head, weighing which ones were credible and which were the result of nervous imagination. She had always been practical, but now she was also a filter. She spoke to the officers about which reports mattered and which did not. She did not dismiss anyone publicly. She knew how it felt to be dismissed. She guided the conversation back to hard, observable facts. The reserve unit that had struck in the pass was moved to a new sector. Its commander sent a brief note to logistics, thanking the depot for the fuel run that had led to the opportunity. The note was a formality, but it was an acknowledgement that the chain of events had begun in the yard. Aaron read the note once and folded it into her ledger. It was not for display. It was a small reminder that the work of moving crates could shape the map. Winter deepened. The cold became a constant, flattening sound, the kind of cold that stole heat through boots and gloves. The snow packed hard and slick, making routes faster but more dangerous. Aaron drove in a steady line, watching for black ice. She kept her speed modest, knowing that a spun truck could block a pass and cost hours. Her days blurred into a pattern of starts and stops, signatures and fuel tallies. In that pattern she found a kind of calm, but she also knew that the enemy was changing with the weather. They would not repeat the mistake of the pass. They would look for other lines, other corridors, other ways to reach behind the main force. One evening, a scout team brought in a prisoner who spoke in clipped, cautious terms about a new enemy unit assigned to identify supply routes. The scout's report said that the enemy had a name for the person who read the snow, a term that translated loosely as the quiet guide. Aaron did not take it as a personal label. She took it as a sign that the enemy knew the supply drivers had become more alert. It meant that any unusual movement on her routes might be watched with more precision. It meant that the enemy would not be drawn by a crude bait again. The war had learned. Aaron adjusted. She coordinated with the depot foreman to alter the visible patterns of supply. They split larger convoys into smaller groups. They shifted the order of runs so that fuel and rations did not always travel together. They staged a few minor decoy loads, empty barrels, light crates along less critical routes to see where the enemy watched. The actions were small and measured. They were not dramatic, but they were the kind of adjustments that turned a supply system from predictable to resilient. There were costs. Smaller convoys meant more trips and more fuel consumed. The drivers were tired, and the mechanics struggled to keep engines running in the cold. Aaron saw fatigue in her crew's faces. She knew that she was pushing them. She weighed each adjustment against the risk of being predictable. In the end, she chose caution over comfort. The enemy was probing, and in winter, a single successful probe could cause a collapse. Her own standing in the unit shifted subtly. She was still not a formal officer, but her notes reached the operations table. A lieutenant asked her to sit in on a route planning meeting. She declined at first, then accepted the next time, sitting quietly along the wall. She did not speak, unless asked. When she did, she kept her remarks short, focused on ground conditions and route visibility. The lieutenant thanked her and dismissed the meeting. She returned to the yard and continued her work, aware that a door had opened but unwilling to walk through it too far. The work needed her in the truck, not in the briefing room. The enemy's search tightened over the following weeks. Erin found a set of tracks that ran parallel to her route for nearly a mile, then vanished into a ridge. The tracks were light and careful, likely scouts on skis. She reported them and altered her route the next day. The day after, she found another set, closer, with evidence of a short stop near a rock outcrop. Someone had been watching. She told her drivers to avoid the outcrop, to keep speed through that section, and to watch their mirrors. She also instructed Marcus Reed to keep a rifle on the seat beside him, not for use in combat, but as a reminder of the risk. They never used it, but its presence added a layer of attention. She also began to log patterns of enemy observation, the days they appeared, the wind direction, the time of day. She kept a small notebook in her coat. The pattern was not obvious at first, but over time she saw that the scouts appeared most often after a clear day, when the snow's surface made tracks easier to read. They appeared less in heavy storms. It was not a revelation, but it helped her plan. She would run more visible convoys in poor weather and keep critical loads under cover when the skies cleared. The war did not pause for these adjustments. There were new skirmishes along the line, smaller and more frequent. The enemy tested the edges, probing for weakness. Erin's supply runs became part of that test. A fuel truck was lost to a slide on a steep pass, not because of enemy action, but because the winter finally broke the edge of the road. Erin helped coordinate the recovery, rerouting supplies and keeping the forward cache from running dry. It was another reminder that the terrain itself was a combatant, indifferent and relentless. In late winter, the command staff held a quiet review of supply procedures. They asked Erin to write a short memo on how logistics observations could be integrated into operational planning. She wrote it in plain language, listing simple steps. Require route reports to include track observations. Assign a liaison from logistics to the operations cell during severe weather. Map supply routes with updated snow conditions. She avoided theory. She wrote what could be done with the people and resources they already had. The memo was circulated. Some officers ignored it. Others adopted parts. In the end, her influence was incremental rather than dramatic. That suited her. She wanted systems, not spotlight. The spring thaw did not come early. Snow remained on the ground, but the days lengthened. The sun returned, weak but steady. Erin drove with a new awareness of light. In longer days, the enemy could observe more. She adjusted accordingly, moving critical loads in dawn and dusk when light was low. The contrast of dark trucks against white fields made stealth impossible, so she focused on speed and timing rather than concealment. She knew that invisibility was not possible. Uncertainty was. Her crew changed around her. Owen Kessler transferred to another unit. A new driver, Logan Pierce, joined the convoy. He was younger and less experienced, with a tendency to drive too fast. Erin corrected him quietly, explaining why speed on ice was an illusion of control. Logan listened. The convoy's rhythm shifted with the new driver, but Erin kept it steady. She reminded herself that logistics was a system of people, and people changed. Her job was to keep the system from breaking when they did. News arrived that the enemy had changed their approach and were using smaller, dispersed units rather than large columns. The pass would not be repeated. Erin was not surprised. The enemy had learned from their loss, just as her unit had learned from the success. She reviewed her old notes and saw that the signs of a large column had been clear in the snow. For smaller units, the signs would be subtler. She told her drivers to look for those subtler signs. A single pair of ski tracks, a short drag mark, a disturbed line of brush. The ground would still speak if one knew how to read its quieter words. The quiet guide rumor persisted, but it became less personal and more like a legend. Erin's name was not attached in official reports. It was attached in the small conversations that happen in a yard. She did not correct those conversations. She understood that in war, stories fill the spaces that official reports leave empty. She did not need to be at the center of a story. She needed the route to be clear and the fuel to arrive. Late in the season, she received a short transfer request from a training unit that had heard of her skill and wanted her to instruct new drivers. It was a chance to move away from the front. She considered it in the quiet of the yard, the snow squeaking under her boots. The offer was not a reward, but it was a recognition. She declined. The front still needed drivers who knew the routes. She was one of them. She did not see herself leaving while the winter still held. She continued, day after day, to run the lines. She kept her logs clean, her reports precise. She watched the snow for new shapes. She watched the horizon for distant smoke. She listened to the radio for changes in tone. The war moved on in small increments. A shift here, a line there. Aaron moved with it, quiet and consistent. The supply yard remained a place of routines. But within those routines,